Hi everyone, this is Jamie and welcome to another episode of the Yogi Within podcast. On today's episode, this will probably be one of the more difficult podcasts I've done. I've talked around this for some time with different episodes on sort of gurus and enabling and some other aspects of the negative sides of worship, you could say, and how potentially cult-like dynamics can affect yoga rooms, and how this is played out in Ashtanga and other yoga communities I've been in, and also in martial art communities and even in workplaces, families. This is inherent to yoga, but I wasn't really ever going to do a specific podcast on this because I think enough's been said on it in some ways, but something came up in the last couple of weeks actually. I listened to someone speak about this that made me inspired me actually a little bit to talk about this, and also something that's happened in martial arts community, and specifically my old club actually, that it's interesting. This kind of happened at the same time, that made me think that I could talk about this in a way that could be constructive. And I think that there's enough material online with people who are, angry, and for good reasons, for things that they've experienced, and for people that anger could be potentially directed towards. But I'm going to try and talk about this more from a nuanced perspective, and also kind of from an outsider. Yeah, you could say potentially I'm an outsider within the Ashtanga community, for example, and some decisions I've made over the years. And I think really what needs to happen, or would be the best thing to happen for healing to take place. And again, I'm going to try to talk about this from a nuanced perspective and more constructive. I think before, when I've talked about this, I have been a little bit critical for good reasons, but purely just sometimes I think it's good to be direct and say things how they are. But there's two sides to a story, and I think that there's lots of reasons why people make good choices and bad choices. But I'm talking a little bit vague at the moment, but I'll get a little bit more into the details. But specifically, I'm going to talk about Patabi Jois and Mr. Iyengar. But really, this isn't, specific to the teachers from Krishnamacharya. This is specific to really a lot of gurus. There's enough examples of this even in recent history. Most people know about Bikram. There's documentaries made about this now on popular streaming services, and even the Kundalini story, which is a bit crazy, really. That these things do happen, and they do happen in yoga traditions, and really they specifically happen in unhealthy environments where there is an unhealthy power dynamic. And I've done episodes on that with the Guru episode, and me and Ian had a very nice discussion about this with regards to self-sovereignty. So check those out if you haven't before. And I respect Ian a lot, and Ian will never really want to go into details specifically about people, and I think that's for good reason. It's not really great to sort of, name and shame people and point people out, and I know why Ian doesn't want to do that, and the same reason I generally don't, is because people make their own choices, and I think that there's a reason people make certain choices. There's a reason people are drawn to certain environments, and there's a reason certain people are drawn to different teachers. And I think it's up to us to understand and take ownership of why we make certain decisions and why we're drawn to certain environments. But, Bikram, Patabi Jois, Iyengar, this Yogi Bhaja, there's enough stories in really most yoga traditions, even in Buddhism and Tantric Buddhism. There's enough stories of abuse, power dynamics, sexual abuse. And again, this is definitely happening in martial arts community, and it's definitely a lot of this coming up lately in the martial arts community. And in a way, I could say that it's probably worse in that environment, in that combative environment with unhealthy power structures. And I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. But the reason this conversation come up, because I had a chat with someone, and the conversation was, how do you feel about practicing Ashtanga yoga, knowing with all of the kind of shady stuff that's gone on, like how do you feel about practicing the system? And this is where I want to start the conversation. This was a good question, and I've thought about this on and off, obviously, over the years. I used to practice Iyengar yoga a little bit in London at the Iyengar Yoga Institute. I actually did a little bit of Kundalini yoga very, very early on in my yoga journey. There was this small church in West London in, where was it? I can't remember. Anyway, it was somewhere in West London. I used to go because the girl who was working there, she was a classically trained musician, and to this day, that's the best gong bath I've ever experienced. And I mostly went for that, if I'm being honest. And I probably did this for a few months, and I went once a week. It was kind of cool, a bit interesting. Obviously, I knew nothing about the origins of Kundalini yoga, and if you don't know about that, I'm not going to go into the history of that. Just go and check that out. It's a bit of a wild story. So I enjoyed aspects of that, and some singing was nice, and the gong bath was excellent. And also some study at the Iyengar Institute. I didn't experience anything untoward there. It was a very beautiful building in West London that they have there, and some very nice teachers. I didn't experience anything negative. I didn't connect with it as a practice. I was drawn to Ashtanga yoga. So this has not been my experience. But, lots of people still practice these practices, even though they're very aware of the origins of these practices, and also the, pretty awful behaviour, especially in the Kundalini world, of the people that created these systems. So I think really people compartmentalize things, and, we tend to take out the things that we like, and we, turn our eyes off towards the things that we don't like. I think we all do that in different aspects of our lives. I'm sure lots of us listen to music from artists that don't have the best track record, or might even be in prison for having done very awful things, abusive things, and maybe we remove the artist from the art. And I think that's something a lot of us do. I'm not into cancel culture. I think it's good to look at things in a nuanced way, and not to look at things in a black and white way. We could say that a particular music artist could write very beautiful music, but could be a very damaged person. I think those two things can be true at the same time. It's completely understandable that someone might stop listening to music from a certain artist because they've done terrible things in their life, and maybe they will never listen to that again, and then stop obviously giving that person money and attention as a kind of moral decision. And I think that that's everyone has to find their own balance with things and their own truth. And I think that it's up to all of us individually to make those kinds of decisions where we sit morally, and the things that we do and we don't want to support. And I think nowadays with cancel culture, it's very much it's more black and white, and I think it's better to look at things nuanced. And I think usually for most systems and most artists and most practices, they don't always start out bad. They don't always start out with the worst intentions. Something happens along that journey where they potentially become morally corrupt, and something goes wrong. And that's largely what this podcast is going to be about, really, is what happens to people along that journey. Why do people become morally bankrupt? At what point does their practices or their art go from being about spreading something in them that they want to share, that they believe is good, to using that as a way to abuse their power. And I think that there is a common theme in this. And as students, we are part of that in some way. And I think that glorifying people and creating this worship environment and putting people on a pedestal is part of the problem. This is part of the problem within these systems of not having self-sovereignty, is giving our power away to an individual or trying to belong to a group where we lose our sense of ourselves. And this is what enables these kinds of dysfunctional behavior. And I think it's up to us to kind of be aware of that as students, to not glorify these people and create these environments where so much money and attention goes to one individual that creates this unhealthy power dynamic. And I think we have to understand why we're drawn to these environments and why this happens. And I think that individual psychology is very different to group psychology. I've studied this a lot on a personal level for my own personal reasons, and I'll go into that a little bit later. So the conversation come up about that, like how do I feel about practicing Ashtanga yoga with what's gone on in the past. And I think that we all have to find our own way with that. I've definitely met Ashtanga practitioners who quit practicing Ashtanga yoga and don't want anything to do with it. I've definitely met other yoga practitioners who've heard the stories about Patabi Jois and the culture within Ashtanga yoga. And I'm not even going to call it a community, really, if I'm being honest, but the culture within Ashtanga yoga studios of avoidance, really, and to not talk about things openly and to shut down conversations. And I think that all of these things add to people leaving the practice or not wanting anything to do with it. And obviously having strong feelings towards teachers that still have pictures of Patabi Jois up and still see him and kind of potentially worship him in that way, knowing what's gone on. And I think what would be a good way to start this conversation is to stop calling them accusations and just being honest about what has occurred. And I think that's probably a good start. Lots of people have talked about this, and I'm going to give a specific example of what I heard recently, again, which is what inspired me to talk about this. I'm going to start firstly with, I'm not going to call this physical abuse. I'm just going to start with cultural differences and how things were different, back in the day, and how these things have transpired into some modern aspects of teaching yoga. And we've seen plenty of examples of this. There's a few examples of this flying around lately of Mr. Iyengar, slapping and punching students who are doing something incorrect, and, hardcore adjustments where people's ligaments and tendons are being broken and, potentially even femurs snapping. And, there's lots of historical accounts of these kinds of hardcore adjustments taking place in yoga rooms. And I think that let's just stay with adjustments for a moment. I've done a podcast specifically on adjustments, so go and check that out if you're interested in that and my view on adjustments in yoga. But I think adjustments are a personal thing, actually, and I think it's up to students to have a relationship with a teacher where that feels good or it doesn't feel good. In my experience, mostly what I experienced in Ashtanga yoga was improper adjustments, if I'm being honest, like way too strong without enough awareness of the teacher, with too much of a focus of just trying to get you deeper into something, even though your breath and everything else that the feedback is probably giving that person is telling them the exact opposite. So that's just my experience. It's very rarely I've met teachers who are very good and adept at giving physical adjustments. They are out there for sure. I know some excellent ones, but that is a skill set on its own. And again, go check out my podcast on that. But I'm not going to talk too much about adjustments today because I've already spoken about that, but really around what can we call this? like corrections or humiliation. I'm not sure the right words, but there's plenty of videos of Iyengar back in the day, who was kind of a showman, really. Physically hitting and slapping students in auditoriums because they did something wrong. And Simon Borg-Olivier, actually, who's been on this podcast, who was a lovely, gentle soul. I love talking to him. He's such a nice person, who studied with Iyengar for many years, did a short video on this, which I think was interesting. And it's a tricky one, yeah. I do believe this is nuanced, and I'm going to try and talk about this in a nuanced way. Things were different back in the day, and we have to just understand that. Not trying to condone things, and I'm going to try to explain this. It's a difficult podcast. If I if I upset or offend anyone on this, believe me, I'm trying to talk about this in a balanced way. Maybe I should just say as a disclaimer, if anyone's suffered physical or sexual abuse from a teacher, my heart goes out to you. I don't condone that whatsoever. I'm just trying to talk about this from a nuanced perspective. Like, for example, my father, from his generation of men in South London, they didn't really talk that much, didn't really talk about their feelings. And, for example, my dad's school, they were caned at school if they did something wrong. My dad was caned more often because he was the eldest of the 6 children, so he just inadvertently took responsibility for things. And, if boys got into a discretion or a problem at school, they were given boxing gloves and put in a ring. And this was normal, yeah? I mean, a lot of us would say this is wrong. I would say there's actually some potentially good things about some of that. Not caning, but boys sorting disagreements out in certain ways. But this was normal, yeah? Physical violence, maybe being corrected physically was normalised in my father's generation, and that's just sort of how things were. And I think that was probably most likely the case back in India back in the day. And actually, when I compare England, where I grew up, to India is quite a violent place, if you ask me. I grew up in a very violent area in South London. People definitely sorted out disagreements quite quickly with violence. That was quite normal. There's some good things and bad things to that, but India is quite hardcore in that way, I would say, especially if you've seen anyone ever get in trouble with the police over there. It's sticks and bats come out quite quickly, and there's definitely a violent element and an ease of use of violence for correction. And I think that for sure, Patabi Jois and Iyengar most definitely would have grown up and around that, and that being normalised. Now, my father grew up like that. But my father would never hit someone to correct him, to humiliate someone. So this is a comparison, yeah? A yoga teacher slapping a student in the head because they did something incorrect is humiliating, yeah? You can give a million reasons to why someone does that, but it's humiliating, yeah? Think about it. If you was in a public room and someone slapped you across the head because you did something wrong with regards to where you put your foot in a yoga position, is ridiculous. I can't think of any way you can condone that in any way. There's no logical reason to do that. That's some unhealthy power dynamic. Yeah, I'm trying to talk about this in a nuanced way. And like I say, my father grew up definitely in a similar way, but he would never have done that. Yeah, he would never have hit someone to correct him, which is humiliating, yeah? So this is the kind of comparison I'm trying to draw. And what I've seen is lots of people try to normalise that and say, well, I never felt anything bad about that. It was normalised in that room. And I think that what happens in closed environments is things get normalised, yeah? In yoga rooms, in offices, in families, these can become mini cults in some way, where you could say bad behaviour gets normalised and it gets rationalised, especially when there is a figurehead that everyone is looking up to and potentially worshipping. And this is where it starts to go off, yeah, and things start to get even more imbalanced. And I think that these environments enable things like that to occur, especially when no one speaks out. Think about it. In any other environment you've ever been in your life, and you saw that happen, most people would be like, what the fuck? And someone would probably say something. Probably a guy would stand up and go, what the fuck are you doing? You know, that would be the ideal situation, yeah, where someone speaks out. If you was on the tube or on a bus somewhere and someone was talking to someone and they slapped them across the head as a way to correct them, everyone would, probably a man would step in and be like, what the fuck are you doing? Especially if he was doing it to a woman. So again, these get normalized in certain environments, but there is in no way that is good. Yeah? I did fighting sports for many years, hardcore. My gym, it was pretty hardcore, yeah. But I had never witnessed a coach slap someone across the head because they did something wrong, yeah. And this is a fighting sport, yeah. It's not yoga. This is where you're fighting every day, 100% sparring, trying to break someone's arm or choke them out, or, you know, in other sports trying to knock them unconscious and that. No coach ever slapped you across the head to correct you because you did something wrong. I did rugby for many years. I've done lots of physical contact sports where that might have been a normal way to do something, and it wasn't, yeah, because it's an insecurity in my eyes, or some unhealthy power dynamic, yeah. Like I say, in fighting sports where you're trying to make people tough, you're trying to make people stronger, you could think that might be a method as a way to, you know, rile someone up or do something. And that was never used in that way, yeah, because there's no benefit from it. There's no benefit other than that particular teacher gaining some power or getting a kick out of making someone feel lesser than them. It's sadistic in nature. This is why I did my guru episode. There's some kind of sadistic nature in some people, and I would say that this is sadistic in nature. And this is why I'm trying to talk about this in a nuanced way. Iyengar did amazing things in yoga, yeah. You know, it's a lot of showmanship, him coming to England and doing these demonstrations, which is a bit ridiculous, really, but it's kind of fun. But he did a lot of really good things, yeah. A lot of people had very good experiences of learning yoga from him. And again, all yoga now really in the West comes from, in some way, Jois and Iyengar, in terms of the vinyasa sequences and the way classes are structured. So there's a gratefulness that we have from these people teaching these traditions and teaching these things to people in the West. But you can also say that Iyengar was a deeply flawed person and sounding very angry and very physically abusive to people and humiliating people in a sadistic way. You could say that's also true. It doesn't mean that potentially you might not ever practice Iyengar yoga, but for some people they probably wouldn't, and I think that's fair, yeah? Some people will watch that video or those videos and hear these stories and be like, why would I want to learn yoga from someone like that? That's someone that obviously doesn't practice self-control and has sadistic tendencies. And I think that's a fair thing to say. His book, Light on Yoga, I think is excellent. I really love his introduction on what yoga is and how he writes about it. And the way he's taught asana, there's some very good things about that. Did he embody yoga in the fullest way? Probably not. Again, don't worship people. Don't put them into these guru placeholders, because they're not. Yeah, Iyengar was not a guru. He's not this special person. Neither was Jois. Yeah, again, we have to keep things in the realm of reality and not build these people into things that they are. This also happens in the martial arts community. Black belts get glorified. You know, when you start doing martial arts as a white belt, and a black belt is basically toying with you. It's such a strange feeling that someone else can have so much power and can basically do anything they want with you. People can put black belts like they walk on water. After doing it for many years, that obviously changes, but there is potentially some unhealthy power dynamics that definitely occur in martial arts, and it's always the same. There's some kind of hierarchical structure, generally with one figurehead at the top. And as Ian stated in the self-sovereignty podcast, it's when students start trying to get life advice and everything else from these people, and really their ego starts to get massively reinforced. Potentially lots of money starts to change hands, and there's this glorification that goes to their head. And what I'm trying to say in this podcast is that this is not good for anyone. It's not good to glorify any teacher to this magnitude or any magnitude. And it's not good for the student to give their power away in that way. I'm completely for teacher-student relationships. Probably people will notice that when Ian's on the podcast, my energy shifts a bit. I definitely go more into a slightly student role, and I think that's just because our relationship started that way. And I actually think it's all right. Ian's a wise person. I like listening to him talk, and he's very well versed in the Ashtanga yoga system. So I naturally go into that role a little bit, and I think that's all right. We do that, and I think that we learn best when that happens. But you still have to keep your integrity and your sense of self-sovereignty, as well as being critical. And I think that, again, what happens in these guru environments and these closed environments where these things get normalized, that just goes out the window. Like I said, I had Simon on here who was talking about these Iyengar videos recently on his Instagram, and I don't think Instagram is a good place to talk about this, which is why I don't talk about these things on social media in that way. You definitely need to talk about these things in a longer format. I was actually going to get a guest on, I still might do, to talk about this, but I thought I would just start with me making an observation about it because I was asked to. But it is. Let's start with this actually. This isn't specific to Ashtanga yoga. This isn't specific to yoga. And I think that this is what I've heard lately from people who are obviously quite angry about all the things that have gone on, that they think that Ashtanga yoga is inherently bad or Iyengar yoga is inherently bad. And I don't believe that to be true. I think that things change. And I think that I'd like to think that Iyengar, Patabi, Jois, and most people that have started these yoga traditions potentially started out with good intentions, and the energy around starting these practices was good. And what they wanted to share, it's just that along the road, things start to go bad. And again, I think this happens from too much attention, too much glorification, and too much inherent power given to one person. There's so many examples of this. This just needs to stop happening. Yeah, and this is what I'm trying to talk about this in a constructive way, is for students to stop glorifying teachers. Yeah, stop giving your power away and building monsters. You're kind of creating monsters. And you could argue this is the same in any field where this happens. Potentially movie stars, artists, Instagram influencers. It's kind of the same energy really, with just over glorification of an individual, where it's really not good for them. It will go to their head. They're receiving lots of attention, lots of power, lots of authority, lots of money. This isn't good for anyone. There's nothing yogic about this. This is why I've talked recently about the deeper limbs of Ashtanga yoga, where ahimsa, satya, the things around the yamas and the niyamas that are more important than learning asana. Yeah, and I think that this is where things start to go bad, and this is kind of what happened in martial arts, really, where the carrot of receiving advancement, the carrot of receiving your new belt, the carrot of receiving new asanas, gatekeeping postures, the carrot of getting a certificate from a studio or a shala, certifications or authorizations, these things, this becomes so strong in students. They want these things so much. They want to be close to that teacher. They feel that being closer to that person is going to give them more power, or give them the chance of receiving these advancements. So it stops them being critical, and it stops them speaking out, because they don't want to lose that. Yeah, it's cult-like, really, and definitely there's elements of Ashtanga yoga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that I did that definitely has some cult-like tendencies if it's not kept in check. Yeah, they have similar structures. This is why I think gatekeeping's wrong. The whole driving students to perfect asanas and dangling carrots of papers is not good for anyone. It doesn't lead to anything good, I believe, and it creates these unhealthy power dynamics. People stop being critical. I've seen this in studios where someone receives a bad adjustment. Potentially, I actually witnessed in one studio, and I heard the guy's knee pop. The teacher looked at him as if to say, "Are you all right?" And the student just carried on as if nothing happened. I talked about this in the adjustment podcast. And it's because that student, I believe, didn't want to not get an adjustment again. Or there was something there around, didn't want to bring up something bad in case it affected the relationship in a negative way. And I think this is all part of these unhealthy power dynamics where talking out and saying something you didn't like or being critical, there's a fear associated to that. And the fear is that you're going to lose something. That teacher then is going to stop helping you, or you might be excluded from the group in some way. And again, like I say, group dynamics and group psychology is very different to individual. And as we talked about in the self-sovereignty podcast, the need to belong to something and that need to stay associated to something that potentially is giving you a lot, and the thought of being excluded is a very powerful thing. And I think that is one of the major reasons people don't speak out. And in Ashtanga yoga, there's a massive culture of people not speaking out and talking about their truths. And it's shit, really. I can't think of a better word than that. And this happened in my martial arts world. It's like, some people didn't want to speak out against things because, maybe the coach might not promote them next year, or, it's just crazy. I never got into all this. I just, like I usually do, I just did my own thing and just cracked on with the work and just dropped all of that stuff, really. But these things have to be talked about. I heard people also saying, stop talking about dead people. And it's like, drop that. You can say what you want. Talk about what you want. You don't owe anyone anything. This whole idea that you shouldn't talk about things in the past is ridiculous. It's like the whole point of this podcast and talking about these things is to learn from these things so that things change. If you're doing things for clickbait and this, that and the other, I think that has a different energy. But the reason I'm talking about this is for change, is to see positive change, because I've met awful Ashtanga teachers that definitely embody all of these kinds of characteristics. I've also met awful managers in businesses that embody these kinds of characteristics. I've met awful family members that embody these kinds of characteristics. This happens in any type of power structure where there is hierarchy or someone has some sort of authority over someone else. And these things can happen. So again, this is not specific to yoga. It happens in many different places. I've witnessed this and experienced this in communities where you share, like in an apartment block and things like that. If you give the wrong person a little bit of power, oh my God, it can be pretty toxic. And if anyone's experienced gaslighting and scapegoating, if you don't know what that is, go and look that up. This is a very common occurrence. This happens a lot. If you've ever been scapegoated, I have experienced this in my own family, actually, and other instances. You will know what that's like. Gaslighting, trying to rewrite history, change people's truths because you don't want to upset the apple cart is bad. And this definitely has, this definitely is part of Ashtanga yoga in that way, if you look at it that way. It's not like that in my studio. And it's not like that in some studios, but inherently, I think you could say that it's been passed down in the Ashtanga yoga culture of silencing people. Now, as I've said previously, I never went to Mysore. I've been to Mysore, but I've never practiced with the Jois family specifically for these kinds of reasons. Yeah, I've talked about this before. I won't go into it more, but I didn't want to put myself in environments like that because you are what you practice. Yeah, my father didn't say a lot. Yeah, but I learned as a kid by what he did. Yeah, my father had a lot of integrity. I would say, he did the right thing because it was the right thing to do. Yeah, my father did lots of really positive, good things. I would call him a protector, and someone who stood up for people. And I was taught that not because he told me, but because I watched him do it 1,000 times. And I think actions speak louder than words. And although we can learn a lot of really positive things from yoga and yogic traditions, really, I think a lot of us learn about life from our parents. And I learned a lot about doing the right thing and speaking out and protecting people and protecting weaker people, protecting the fairer sex, women, because it's the right thing to do, not because someone else is watching or not because it's popular or not because it's all right to do it, just because it's the right thing to do. And it's in my nature to speak out and say things that way, justice. That's sort of the way I was brought up. My father embodied that. A lot of my uncles were really like that. So the men in my life were like that. So for me, this was normal. You just do that, not because you're trying to be courageous. It's not courageous. It's just normal to speak out about things when you see injustice. If someone is on the bus and they're getting mugged, you step in and you do something. That's just where I grew up. That was normal, to sort of speak out and do things. And I think that not all of us have grown up that way. And I think that also, again, for group psychology, the fear of being expelled, the fear of being rejected, and probably I'm going to give this story in a minute of someone who talked about this recently, is there's a lot of loss that can occur if you do speak out. Yeah, and I'll go into a little bit in a minute. I might go into that a bit about my dad in a minute as well, because I think this is also relevant. But maybe I'll get into that a bit later. And this kind of try and tie this in somehow. But people have had different experiences of this. People have had different experiences of practicing with Iyengar. People have had different experiences of practicing, I'm sure, in different yoga stances. And I think that we all have to have our own truth of what we've experienced. People can have different experiences from adjustments. People can have experiences with teachers, whether it's they feel something's off or they feel something's good. And we all have to have our own truth and make our own understanding of that. But I think that what's happened in some communities is really shutting down conversation and trying to control narratives, because potentially there's a loss of income or other things that are going on with this. I think with regards to Pattabhi Jois, I think we really need to stop calling these accusations. There's enough people that have talked about this and been open about it, that he was basically groping women, sexually regularly. I think there's enough people that have spoken about this to stop calling these accusations. I think that it's called for people to have their own experiences and their own take on what that is. But again, look up scapegoating and look up gaslighting. You have to listen to people and what their experiences have been. And from what I've heard from teachers and senior teachers back in the day, it sounds like everyone knew this was going on. This wasn't some sort of secret. It sounds like everyone or most people knew what was going on and just didn't do anything about it. Just were silent and just shut down conversations about this. And this is bad, I mean, people make mistakes, people are flawed, but it's more about how you deal with things and how you handle it. And I think that situation was handled terribly, which is why I think people still talk about it. And I think the people that experience this are still angry about it because it hasn't been healed, really. Healing comes from transparency and truth. It doesn't come from... mostly what I've seen around this is a PR campaign, really. Insta famous teachers and the people that still make a lot of money out of being associated to Patabi Jois, and the stories of back in the day and going to the old Shala and that, it's still a bit of a selling point for people, and I think that it's easier to rewrite history and a lot of revisionism with what I see from this than it is to be very honest about people's behaviour around this and how they didn't deal with it and how they really just neglected this and tried to probably hoped it went away for their own reasons. And I have compassion for this in a way because I think it's nuanced. I think that people had got a lot from practicing Ashtanga yoga. They got a lot from the community that they felt they had at the time going to Mysore and practicing there, and the friends that they made and what the system itself gave them, which I think the system in itself is excellent. But also you're witnessing this abhorrent behaviour and people trying to, for all intensive purposes, protect people from it in the sense of, that's the wrong word, not protect people from it, but silence people and shut down conversations and intimidate people into not talking about these things because if they knew how much they were going to lose. And the reason I'm saying this is because I don't really talk about names on this podcast because I don't think it's important, but I heard Eddie Stern talk about this on a few posts lately and on a podcast, and this inspired me to talk about this. This was really the only time I've ever heard someone honestly talk about this, and I think not that you need a man to affirm this, but it was good to hear a guy talk about this. And really honestly, what I heard from Eddie was, and if you don't know who that is, look him up, but he was one of the earlier practitioners going to Mysore and definitely spent most of his career glorifying Patabi Jois and made a lot of money through that process. But I heard someone who felt shame. I heard someone who I felt love from listening to him talk about this, if I'm honest. And I know people have got a lot of anger still towards him, and probably for good reasons. But when I heard him talk about his lack of his moral compass, really, I'm trying to think of the word he used in the podcast, but he kind of sacrificed his moral compass as a person and as a man, because he didn't say anything at the time when this was going on. And from his perspective, everyone knew about this. So all the teachers that you know and follow on Instagram knew about this and knew it was going on. I'm laughing, it's not a funny matter, but didn't say anything. And I think that they probably still don't because of the same reasons Eddie didn't. And Eddie was very honest about this. And again, this was the most honest, transparent conversation I've ever heard about this. This was someone who, to me, felt shame and regret. I think he's lost all of his student base from stopping teaching Ashtanga yoga. He doesn't practice it anymore. I don't think he wants to be associated to Patabi Jois whatsoever, for obvious reasons. And there's a deep psychology there that I'm sure he'll probably spend the rest of his life trying to fully understand. And regret, which was not doing the right thing, not doing the right thing at the time when this was going on, and chose really money, status, and an attachment to that money and status over doing the right thing, over the yamas and the yamas, over the ethics of yoga. So again, and I think that's largely what I've seen from the Ashtanga community with regards to this, is a PR campaign, really, is a business trying not to lose money. And it was so refreshing to hear someone talk about this in a very honest and transparent way, that, they chose those things over doing the right thing. And I felt a lot of love, actually, for Eddie talking about this in that way. I love stories of redemption and change. And I think that this is baked into yoga traditions. This is baked into the stories I've given on here of like Milarepa and Mapa, around change, and that comes from honesty and transparency and truth, not from what I've really largely seen in the Ashtanga world, which is businesses trying not to lose money. I actually did a quick Google the other day because lots of these teachers come to Oslo and do workshops, and on the one hand they have these kind of Me Too sort of blog posts that it seems like a PR company helped them put together to avoid accountability, really. Just, I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, but I feel very bad for anyone that experienced this. Very wishy-washy, Teflon-y, just, I don't know how much I want to get into this. I'm not trying to turn people out. I just think that how Eddie dealt with this should be the standard, not these PR campaigns of avoidance and a lack of accountability. I literally, with Eddie, I heard someone to speak truthfully, and it's so nice to hear the truth, because when you hear it, there's a vibration to it that is completely different. And I think people can heal from that period, from people doing what Eddie's done and just being really honest about it. People make mistakes. Like Eddie obviously is being open about a mistake that he made, and he's practicing yoga. Yeah, he's really practicing yoga of redemption, of moksha. He's liberating himself from pain, from his lack of his moral compass, not doing the right thing. He now has more integrity. Yeah, that's what we're looking for. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one's looking. Integrity is doing it because it's just the right thing to do. Yeah, my father embodied this. Yeah, I grew up looking up to him really like that he would have done the right thing. Doesn't matter how much money was involved, whatever, he would have just done the right thing. He was that kind of person. And I think that this to me is yoga. This is a yogic value to promote, and I like to promote these things on this podcast. And I think that's why Ashtanga yoga, people just still have that bad taste in their mouth, because the celebrity teachers just haven't really done this. And I don't think these are people really to look up to in terms of yoga. But, choosing money, status and feeling important over doing the right moral thing is not good. Yeah. And I think that to learn from this is to learn from what inspired me with Eddie's conversation of just being very transparent and honest about faults and failures that people might have had. I think it's okay. People aren't perfect. And I think that, again, glorifying people and making them into these perfect people is part of the problem. They make mistakes. Patabi Jois is fallible, obviously. Yeah, it doesn't mean that he didn't. I'm grateful that Patabi Jois taught yoga in his basement for years to basically nobody, and that eventually some Westerners got there and just started bringing it over here. I'm super grateful for that. It's been super beneficial for my life, for my students' lives. But he was also a fouled person. I wouldn't have a picture of Patabi Jois up in my shala, personally. I don't really associate, in a way, the Ashtanga system to him directly. I think he's obviously part of it being passed down, but I don't think of Patabi Jois when I'm practicing Ashtanga yoga. So that's the question, really, when someone asks me this, is Ashtanga yoga is not Patabi Jois. Yeah, the system is the teacher, but he also did a lot of good things. Yeah, maybe he wasn't like that in the beginning. Maybe it wasn't so. Obviously these things got worse as he got older. So again, too much attention, too much glorification, kissing people's feet, and all of these things that, to me, probably enable this kind of behavior, shutting down conversation, gaslighting people, scapegoating people. None of this is good. So this is the change that needs to happen in yoga traditions, is stop glorifying people. This is what creates monsters. It creates these environments, and it doesn't help with teachers that are still whitewashing this and trying to shut this down and choosing Eddie said this in his podcast. It's 101 Buddhism, really. You're not really practicing yoga. if you're choosing an attachment to status, money, and power over doing the right thing. And you could say that's largely what a lot of Ashtanga teachers have done, according to Eddie and other people that have spoken about this. They all knew what was going on, whether you had a different experience of it yourself or not. This was talked about. This was common knowledge as far as Eddie and other people are concerned. Yeah, so people knew. So these Me Too blog posts of, there was a teacher that came to Oslo recently, and I heard him on a podcast. Someone sent it to me, and I listened to it, and it was the same, laughing and joking about people's experiences of abuse, which is crazy to me. And I didn't receive that adjustment, and I never saw that. It's like, yeah, but you knew what was going on. Yeah, you all knew what was going on, and you chose to not speak out and challenge that and talk about it. I have compassion for that, because like I say, I think group dynamics and group cult-like dynamics enable that kind of behaviour and stop critical conversations going on. But again, this is why I didn't go. I would have lasted 2 minutes. I don't think I would have lasted very long. I would have, it's just not in my nature. But and I've also heard a lot of anger towards men about this, and I think that it's understandable, really. I'm quite traditional. Again, I was brought up to protect people, like men protect women, you protect the fairer sex, you step in, you do something, I think a lot of men grow up like that. A lot of, in England especially, my father's generation, you open doors for women, you carry heavy things, it's just English gentleman thing. You're just brought up that way. It's normal. It's nothing special. It was a bit different when I moved to Norway, because that's not so well received here. The first girl I dated was in Norway. She didn't like this. She didn't like me opening doors for her and carrying bags. She was, I used to piss her off. So, not everyone appreciates those things, but I think most people do, and I think most men are brought up in that way, and I was brought up that way. My father has a strong connection to that for personal reasons that I don't really think it's important to go into on this podcast. But so I think when you're in an environment, probably as a woman, and you're seeing abusive behaviour going on and no men are speaking out about it, it's bad. I mean, it's like, what are we doing here? It's like being on a bus and a woman is being groped, or something off is going on and no guy stands out and does something. I mean, this is becoming normalised, to be honest. I don't like it, but that's not how I was brought up, and that's not what I would do. And I'm not trying to white knight this. I'm just trying to say that this is what needs to change. Don't get into this cult-like environments where people don't speak out and say things. I gave a story on this podcast. I'll give it quickly again. One of my students was attacked on the way to the Shala one morning, and the attack was bad, but she said what was worse was that no one helped her. There was men there in the street, and none of them helped her, none of them stepped in and did anything, and to her that was worse. And I think for probably women that have experienced abusive behaviour in, whether it's yoga studios or work environments or wherever, is men that sit there and do nothing. I can hear my accent changing a little bit the more I talk about this, because when I get a bit annoyed, my South Londoner kicks in a little bit more. But it's just not good. I wasn't brought up that way. Don't normalise this. This isn't, I think that, I'm not sure how that happened in yoga, where yoga is about this kind of softy, don't offend anyone approach. Yoga's about truth and transparency. If you see something bad going on, you shout out, "Oi, what the fuck are you doing?" You say something. This is how these things should be treated. And I think that in cult-like environments, this is not done. This is kind of a red flag. I've talked about these red flags on this podcast before, but when you see something abusive going on and no one says anything, you're in some kind of cult-like environment. Most environments, someone will speak out and say something and call out bad behaviour. In cult-like environments, this is even harder. Truth tellers, people that speak out against things aren't always well received in some environments. And if you've ever been in a toxic work environment or in a dysfunctional family, truth tellers are vilified. And I think this is also what's happened in Ashtanga yoga and these other cult-like environments in yoga. Truth tellers are vilified. There's lots of accounts of this in history. I've experienced this personally, so I've got a stronger connection to that. I mean, there's lots of accounts to this. Socrates could be a good example of people who are vilified for speaking the truth. And I think that when you challenge an authoritative figure and you challenge bad behavior in a cult-like environment, it's too difficult for people to comprehend, and it's easier to gaslight people, shut down conversation, call people crazy, attack their character, and as a way to stop open conversation. And this definitely happened in Ashtanga yoga. This has definitely happened in Iyengar yoga. Bikram yoga is probably a crazier example, as well as Kundalini yoga. I mean, this is, again, it's not specific to yoga, but this is just inherently entrenched in these kinds of environments where bad behavior is normalized, and then it's people are gaslit into accepting it as normal. And again, this happens in martial arts. And again, I think this can be worse. There's lots of cases of this in the things that I used to do with rape, child molestation. I mean, I don't want to get into those details, but it's just awful where, again, there's these patterns of control, figurehead, carrot dangling of something that students want. It creates these environments, but it doesn't mean that they're all like that. My room's not like that. I've practiced it definitely in really great Mysore rooms that are not like that at all. So again, I don't think this is inherent to Ashtanga yoga. I think people like us to associate that, but I don't think that's true. It's the system itself, bandha, breath, drishti, asana. These are life-changing practices. It's just about how they're taught. Yeah. When I was in martial arts, those martial arts systems were great. I just steered myself away from toxic teachers. And you have to trust your intuition with this, because something came out about one particular coach at my old gym I can't go into the details on this podcast, but my intuition told me to stay away from that person. And after what I found out recently, I was 100% right. Yeah, you have to trust your intuition around some people and just steer away. And I think that let's think about this particular coaching, for example, or we could say some yoga teachers. The attainment of asana, or getting a black belt, or receiving new postures, and the money that might be associated to that, or the status that might be associated to that, if students are choosing that over whether someone is a good person, that's when things start to go amiss. And that's when I think the enabling starts to kick in. I did a podcast specifically on enabling, and I think that is a big driver as to why people try to, just compartmentalize things and choose to not see things and ignore things, because they want that other thing so much. And again, speaking out is vilified. Yeah, being that person that speaks out of an injustice, you're going to be shamed, vilified, potentially kicked out of the group. And that's hurtful, especially if you're very attached to that identity, which is why I personally have tried not to. I think that Ashtanga yoga is a great practice, but if you get too attached to the identity of it, the same with other martial arts I've done, you blurs the lines around being critical of the things that have gone on. And I think that, again, we have to kind of have self-sovereignty around that. What can I say? Maybe I've said enough on this. And again, this is coming from a place of love, yeah? I think this is really about learning from these things and not trying to just call people out. But this still goes on, I mean, like I say, there's teachers that come to Oslo where on the one hand, they've got this kind of Me Too thing about injustices and this, that and the other, and around Jois and what might have gone on, but at the same time on their bio I looked at this the other day just out of curiosity before this podcast. They call him Patabi Jois, the legendary Patabi Jois. So what is it? Is he a sexual predator or is he a legendary Patabi Jois? It's kind of what are we doing here? Yeah, and again, it's nuanced. I think people are troubled. Yeah, on one hand, there's this person and this place that's given them so much, but on the other hand, you looked the other way when abhorrent behaviour was occurring. I think ultimately we have to find our own peace with those things, and think about why we made certain decisions. And I think that Eddie, he's probably still got a long way to go from what I heard on that path of redemption and kind of finding inner and outer peace with that situation. But I think that's the road to go down, is transparency and truth and being honest about what people did and what people didn't do. And instead of these PR campaigns and, I didn't see any, this kind of energy of avoidance. It's like, no wonder people are still pissed off. And the women that were on the end of this, really, or men that were on the end of this in terms of, hardcore adjustments that broke things and things like that, or silenced into not talking about these things. It's none of this stuff is good, yeah. And I think that this does continue in Charlotte. Yeah, I had a conversation with someone recently, and I said, in other Ashtanga groups, it's not good to talk about things. Some Ashtanga shalas are like this. Some Ashtanga communities are like this, where the culture is to not speak out. The culture is to not be honest about things. People conform and they keep things to themselves. There's things they want to ask. There's conversations they want to have. But the culture is to not do that. And you will know it when you've experienced it. And this was a conversation I had with a student where they felt that in another environment. And I've had this conversation with other students and other practitioners where some shalas in some environments, the culture is to not speak out. And if you do, it's met with aggression and all of the kind of red flags that would tell you that this is probably not a healthy environment. And I said, do you experience that at my shala? And they said, no. And I said, exactly. So there are spaces where transparency, truth, openness is promoted and encouraged. You kind of know you're in a healthy space when it's like that. When it's not, there's lots of red flags there, So again, we will have to find out our peace with this. And what I've seen lately really is a lot of revisionism. It's people trying to rewrite the past because it's just too difficult to go into. I think it's too difficult to accept. And really, I might finish with this. Probably the hardest thing to do, and I think that's why I applauded Eddie for doing this, is it says something about your moral judgment. And I think that if you're a yoga teacher, especially these kind of celebrity yoga teachers, I think that's the problem in itself, is your brand is you. You've built a business and a brand on you as a person, and you're selling yourself as this kind of yoga practitioner. And, yamas, niyamas, being a good person, truthfulness, honesty, these things. But at the same time, for years and maybe decades, you ignored and gaslit people about physical and maybe potentially sexual abuse. To admit that is a very difficult thing. And for Eddie to admit that, that takes a lot of courage to do that. That takes a lot of inner strength and soul searching to do that, and to do that publicly. Yeah? So I think most yoga teachers are not doing that because their business would die, really, probably overnight. If you're one of these more celebrity teachers that often come to Oslo, if you openly said, yeah, you know what, I knew all that was going on and I didn't do anything, I didn't speak out, it says a lot about your character and who you are as a man, especially around not helping people and not helping women. And I think that to admit that is to admit that and be honest with yourself and people is yoga, because it is the path, it's a redemption path, yeah, to be honest with yourself about our failures, yeah. I think that's part of yoga practice, to we're not perfect. I'm not. I'm not trying to white knight this podcast. I don't mean that. I am a flawed person. Everyone is. I've made lots of mistakes. I think it's more about how you deal with it and how you handle it. Like just being honest about things and being truthful about things and admitting your failures and flaws as a person. I would rather learn yoga from someone like that, actually. That someone who had been through difficult things, learned from it and changed. I think that's a real sign of depth of character. But I think that the continuation of the Teflon avoidant, I didn't see anything, I didn't do anything, it doesn't help that. And I think that it's also true that people had different experiences of practice. I think that's also true. I'm not saying that that's not true. I think that people could have definitely had different experiences of practice with all of these different teachers and not had a bad adjustment potentially, or didn't feel any way that something sort of sexual energy was transferred in any way. But it's common knowledge. Yeah, I think, again, these are not allegations. Yeah, I'm not trying to be a detective here, but enough people have spoken about this, men and women, to just be very clear that these are not allegations. This was going on. Yeah, whether you choose to accept that or listen to that is your prerogative. But I think that it's good to just acknowledge that people experience these things, and men experience watching these things happen and didn't say anything. This is not. I don't think people are making these stories up. I think these are true for things that people are sharing. And I think that, again, if you've ever been in an environment with gaslighting and scapegoating, shutting down conversation and calling people crazy is kind of part of that. And I think that this is intolerable. It's not good for things. But I don't think these conversations are good on Instagram. I don't think doing posts about this is very constructive. I think it's just usually a lot of people like rage baiting and it needs a deeper conversation. It needs a longer conversation. And really, I might finish with this. That I was going to call this integrity. Yeah? Integrity is the quality of being honest and adhering to strong moral and ethical principles, consistently doing the right thing even when no one is watching. It comes from the Latin word integer, and the meaning of this word is wholeness. Yeah, integrity is being whole. And when I listened to Eddie's story, it sounded like he wasn't whole for a long time. He was practicing this system, really glorifying this man, but at the same time was completely conflicted in his own moral compass and what he was practicing as a yoga practitioner. I heard him say he got into yoga to explore consciousness and love and things like that. And how do you do that when you're so conflicted like that? I would say you're not feeling very whole. Wholeness comes from truth and kind of being transparent. And love and honesty comes from that, yeah, and having integrity. And I think that the Instagram, the kind of Ashtanga celebrities, I don't see a lot of integrity, if I'm being honest. Integrity is about consistency. Your actions match your words. You practice what you preach. Accountability, you take responsibility for your mistakes. Instead of shifting blame. Transparency, you are honest and do not deceive others, even when it might be to your disadvantage. These are the core characteristics of most religious traditions, especially yogic traditions. And this needs to be the bedrock of what these things are based on, not chasing asanas or getting certificates, or in martial arts, winning competitions and getting belts. And again, when I spoke to some old training partners of mine who are coaches now, who coach kids and that, and it's about setting moral, setting examples and doing the right thing, and having integrity, having integrity in our practices, and setting good examples and speaking out about injustices and things that go wrong, and not enabling dysfunctional behaviour. Yeah, really, a lot of this is about enabling. And I think as students, we have what's the word? it's up to us to not, like I said, you create monsters, yeah, by glorifying people and giving them so much attention and not speaking out when something's going wrong. You're creating the environment for this to happen. And again, I have a lot of compassion for people that have felt conflicted in this, because I think group psychology and group dynamics is very difficult. And I think that is challenging in itself, especially when you have such a strong attachment to something. And like Eddie said, this was his livelihood. So really speaking out and being honest about this, he probably knew he was going to lose his business. And that's no joke. Yeah, I have a lot of compassion for that. I'm not trying to white knight this and saying that you should just this, that, and the other. It's nuanced, and that's why I'm trying to talk about this on this podcast. It's a very nuanced thing. There's a lot of loss, but really, if you're practicing yoga and you're calling yourself a yoga practitioner and teacher, attachment to these things is the thing that you should be considering the most. This is again baked into yogic traditions, but maybe I've said enough on this. I was going to finish this with one other kind of story in this. I don't know if I need to really. Let me just check my notes quickly. I mean, something else I listened to from Eddie's story was about forgiveness. And what I heard was someone who hadn't really fully forgiven themselves. And I think that this is love, yeah? When you admit your faults and what you did wrong, this is the path to forgiveness and self-love. And again, when I've spoken about this on other podcasts, that the deeper levels of consciousness, in my view, only come from love and honesty. And if you're not being really honest with yourself and you're not practicing a huge amount of self-love and forgiveness, I don't believe that these higher states are even achievable. So if you're really interested in going into the deeper levels of yoga, these have to be practiced. Yeah, not avoidance and lack of accountability, but love, self-love, forgiveness, and that comes from transparency and being honest. So I think that has to happen for people to experience these different things. And I think that really in yoga, the same in martial arts, unfortunately, I think performance has been rewarded over behaviour. And I think that that's the slippery slope. Is Ashtanga yoga just physical gymnastics where you're rewarding someone for how well they are in terms of flexibility and strength? Or are you rewarding people over their behaviour and how they're acting? And I think that this is the good thing about change. Yeah, what are we rewarding in yoga studios? What are you promoting in your yoga studio? Is it performance, or is it the deeper aspects of yoga around behavior? And this was the same in martial arts. Martial arts, I would say, has changed a lot, and it's become much more of a performance-based sport where winning and performing is definitely rewarded over whether you're a good person or not. And I think that's the shift that's gone on in martial arts, why behavior has got worse. Because I think that it doesn't matter if you're a piece of shit, you're abusive, and you're an addict to something, but you're good on the mats and you win a lot of competitions. It doesn't really matter as long as you're winning. It doesn't really matter, and until it gets exposed, and I think that's why people aren't speaking out. Is that like this Taylor Hunt thing recently, lots of people want to be associated to people while it's making them money and it's helping their business. But as soon as the truth comes out about that person, they drop them like a bad stone. And again, this comes back to integrity. Yeah, what are we doing in these practices? Who are we associating with? Who are we promoting? Yeah, are you promoting someone just because you might make money out of it? Or is it because they're a good person and it's good to promote what they do? These are things that I think we should reflect on around what we're rewarding. And, a lot of yoga things now are acting more like businesses, really, because let's say, for example, like Nike, you know, they'll have athletes on their books who are winning lots of competitions. You know, Lance Armstrong, Tiger Woods, Marion Jones. You know, there's lots of people that have been on Nike's books over the years. But once, you know, it kind of comes out that they're not the best person, or, you know, maybe they've been cheating in competitions, they drop them like a stone. And I think that's what's gone on in the yoga world. You know, people are definitely acting more like businesses. It's more about brand protection than it is about the deeper aspects and the higher limbs of Ashtanga yoga, the 8 limbs of Ashtanga yoga, not rewarding performance and money, but, you know, rewarding the things that are more around making better people. I might leave that there. I've probably said enough on this. I think this could be another conversation to have with someone, a guest actually. And again, I've talked about this on and off with different aspects, but I think it's been good today to talk about it specifically to people without really calling anyone out. I've got a lot of compassion for people that have been on the receiving end of these abusive things, and I've actually got compassion for people that have been in these kind of gaslighting echo chambers, because I think it's difficult. I think it's really hard for people psychologically to be honest with themselves about what they witness and what they experience, because it takes a lot of inner reflection and it's courage to do that. And I think even Eddie said, you know, he didn't really have the strength to do this before because it was just too much. And I think that's honest. Yeah, it's honest to sort of think about how much strength and courage you have to speak out and say something that's going on. I think that's difficult, but we should reward that. And I know a lot of people have a lot of anger towards Eddie still, but I think we should promote people and promote people being honest and transparent. And it takes a lot of courage to do that. Okay, bye. Ciao.